In 1996, Nintendo and Square Enix brought us the game Super Mario RPG, and later brought us a remake in 2023. The original Mario RPG was remembered for its colorful cast of characters like Geno, insert Smash Bros. Joke here, and Mallow. It also gave us playable Bowser and Princess Peach. It was an interesting ragtag group for an RPG adventure. Mario RPG is host to its fair share of weird and wild scenarios and characters, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons that it was fondly remembered and why it has always had a fan outcry for its return in some form. The fact that we got that in the form of an entire remake is honestly a bit mind-blowing, given that Nintendo seemingly wanted us to forget this game ever existed. I mean, Square Enix, or Square at the time, had pretty free reign on what they could put into this game, so it often feels more like a Final Fantasy game than a Mario game. I mean, what is that? And that! All of that aside, the remake is now a thing, and along with it comes a visual makeover, gameplay tweaks, additional content, and a shiny new soundtrack. Today we're going to talk about that soundtrack. Why? Well, because 1, I love the original to bits and pieces, and 2, because it has some interesting things by virtue of being a remake. Things that set it apart from not just the original soundtrack, but music for remakes in general. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start with some examples that show what I'm talking about. Also, there will be major spoilers for this game, including the endgame, secret bosses, etc. If you don't want to be spoiled on a remake of a game from almost 30 years ago, you have been warned. Anyway, let's start with something basic that you can find riddled throughout so many tracks in the remake: orchestration variations. That is to say, changing the roles of the instruments within the piece. The original soundtrack uses a common trick in video game music, looping the track in order to extend its playtime to, effectively, infinity, which has a variety of uses. For one, it saves space on the game cartridge. It also means that the music can, well, play indefinitely. In the case of a game like this, where the music really adds to the atmosphere and player experience, it's important for it to not just stop and leave silence. Why am I bringing this up? Well, one of the remake's biggest strengths, in my opinion, is that the loops for many of the tracks are actually extended. How? Well, through orchestration variations. By changing things like the lead instrument or swapping in and out different instruments, you can effectively turn what would otherwise be a loop in the original into an entirely new section. Music theory. Now, the melodic material is kept mostly the same as the original, so it's not like entirely new musical material is being added, but this is much more in line with traditional music. I mean, it'd be like if every single verse in a song was the exact same. As a light example, Hello Happy Kingdom swaps out the clarinets in the opening line for low strings at the loop point of the melody. It's very brief, and it only takes a tiny bit for the clarinet to come back in, and then the brass comes back and the track loops. Danger Aplenty on the Journey similarly varies the instruments for just the first line before looping. This is Booster Tower is essentially doubled in length before looping, since the original loop is now a lower string variation all the way through. However, there are cases where these orchestration variations have a much larger impact on the second loop. Of course, I'm sure most of you who've heard the soundtrack know which one I'm talking about. It's the one everyone talks about. It's The second theme for Booster's Tower, and That Makes Me Booster, has a wildly different second run through, with the end of the first loop now building up to a big band reprise. The next section is also changed up, and, well, let's just say... Okay, let's talk about Beware the Forest Mushrooms. This track also has a different second loop, but not just via changing instruments. Namely, there are two things. Firstly, the Oompa Loompa pizzicato strings, which act as rhythmic anchors in a piece with no rhythmic percussion, are taken out at the start of the second loop. They're still there, just more sporadic at first, but then they come back before the pre-chorus. Can I call it a pre-chorus? But the second thing, oh boy, the second thing. This new violin part serves so many different purposes. There's the obvious fact that it's a beautiful set piece of the second half of the track, distinguishing itself from the first half. This in turn helps lead us to the grander climax. However, I also want to think about this on a deeper level. Beware the Forest Mushrooms is like the track of Super Mario RPG. When people think of Super Mario RPG, this track, not even really the location the track plays in, is one of the first things they will remember. That and, well... I like to look at this additional line as a love letter to the original, like sprinkles on ice cream, or interactive features in a museum. You can still appreciate the ice cream or museum on its own, but the additions are nice, and don't take away from what's already there. On that note, I would like to bring attention to one feature the remake brings, which is the setting to swap between the remake and the original soundtrack. This sort of thing isn't unusual for remakes, but it also isn't something that every remake of every game offers. From an outsider's perspective, you might think that an updated, live, instrumental version of the soundtrack would completely overshadow the original. On the other hand, there will always be the OG fans preferring the original, whether it's nostalgia, or just personal preference, or other reasons. The thing I want to discuss is how this feature actually works in favor of both soundtracks. I mean, there was a reason that the original soundtrack is so beloved and held in high regard. On a technical level, it was pushing the limits of what the SNES was capable of. It incorporated so many auditory effects that were typically difficult to implement. Also, consider that Yoko Shimomura, the composer for the game, does write for games like Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, very fantastical, imaginative series. Consider that that composer is writing music for a Mario game, which, while still very imaginative and fantastical, is certainly a bit more goofy and jovial. I mean, he's a plumber, not a sword-wielding knight. It's certainly a deviation from the works of Koji Kondo, but at the same time, Shimomura's style just works with the context of a Mario role-playing game, a genre typically associated with fantasy, medieval settings, and now we have to throw Mario into the mix, something that the music fully matches. There are even a plethora of references to classic Mario music by Kondo. All this to say that the original is beloved by many and held in high regard. So the option to switch between the remake and original soundtrack is not just about nostalgia, but also a recognition of the original's brilliance, as well as Nintendo saying, hey, we know how much people love the original soundtrack, so here's an option to listen to it, just like the good old days. The remade OST doesn't take away from the original either, as both can stand on their own 2 feet and come with their own strengths. Just like the remake of Beware the Forest Mushrooms, there are plenty of examples of our sprinkles on ice cream content, which respects and builds off the original's musical ideas. Here's some examples. The opening demo mode now has some extra staccato strings. The theme for Marrymore, a town with a wedding chapel, has a new violin solo that interplays with the original melody. Tadpole Pond is nearly tripled in length, now with a build-up to a sick brass ensemble along with the steel pan. Even the file select theme has some new underlying strings, highlighting the harmonics along with some nice little ornamentation with various winds. Now, I've been avoiding discussing a specific type of track, the battle themes. You typically hear them all quite a lot in a playthrough, given how many normal and boss battles you will go through, so it stands to reason that one might get a bit sick of them. Like... And while I don't think it's quite an egregious issue in this game, partly because the themes are absolute bops, the remake adds something new to these tracks, something directly tied with a brand new game mechanic, the chain combo system. By successfully timing your action commands to increase the effectiveness of your attacks or decrease damage taken, you can build a chain combo, providing stat buffs and filling up the new move gauge system. Fully filling the gauge allows your party to perform a triple move, a strong limit break type move that does various beneficial things depending on the active character. It's a nice new addition, bringing along a bunch of nice looking animations, and adds an extra option in one's strategies. But you want to know what I like the most about the addition of the move gauge? Well, once you hit a chain combo of at least 5, every single battle track is granted additional percussion, which heightens the sense of thrill. It also tells the player, hey, you did good, you're growing in power because you can time your button presses, just as the music is growing in intensity. By the same token, the percussion will drop out as soon as that chain is broken, which only occurs once the player misses their timing. This is certainly not something new for video games. I mean, building up chains of anything in games is oddly addicting for us mere mortals. Think combo multipliers in fighting games, hitting strings of perfect beats in rhythm games, or stringing together a huge chain reaction in a puzzle block game. But yeah, when we mess up our combo, it's good for the game to make it abundantly clear that we messed up, because it takes away that rush of adrenaline that we get, that literal surge of power. It makes us want to build it up again, to get out of that rut that is the non-chain themes of the battle themes. Now, from here on, I'm going to be discussing both the ending, post-game, and optional secret content, such as the secret boss, for both the original and the remake. So if you don't want to get spoiled, get out. Okay, so I want to talk about Culex and his adaptation in the remake. For those who don't know, Culex is a secret super boss available towards the end of the game. While he originates from Mario RPG, his design is very reminiscent of those seen in Final Fantasy. Plus, he has a whole theme with crystals, which is a concept a lot of Final Fantasy games explore. Anyways, in the original game, he is accompanied by a rendition of the boss battle theme from Final Fantasy II, as well as the Final Fantasy Victory theme and main theme. That alone makes this a cool tribute, but it goes much further than that. For starters, Culex's dialogue in both the original Japanese and all versions in the remake have him question Mario's world and the fact that it has a third dimension to it. At the time, Mario RPG was a technical marvel both graphically and musically. Most SNES RPGs, and SNES games for that matter, were flat, two-dimensional. Mario RPG created 3D models for the game and rendered them into 2D sprites, which combined with its isometric environments gives off a pseudo 3D effect. So even back then, Square was acknowledging the technical advancements being made on RPGs. Jump to the remake 27 years later, and now we're dealing with an actual 3D game. So now the joke translates even better now. So much so that they actually kept both Culex's sprite as well as all of the Final Fantasy themes from the original. It's hilarious, smart, and keeps the spirit of the original concept intact by giving an even greater juxtaposition with the rest of the game. But, of course, it goes even further than that. Well, beyond Culex just kinda versus the now. Going back to the dialogue, in both the original and the remake, Culex describes wishing to utilize the power of 3D to become more powerful. In the original, this was likely nothing more than another layer to the joke of his 2D-ness, but the remake actually grants Culex his wish, giving him a more powerful, super-duper boss form to fight once you reach the post-game. But becoming a 3D model isn't the only glow-up Culex got. And it still has the combo chain percussion. I can't help but just view this as a heartfelt letter to the fans of the original. The modernization of the Final Fantasy themes just adds so much to both the long-running joke, as well as the whole idea of video games developing and growing more advanced across history. It pays respect to video game history, but it also has so much fun while doing it. Lastly, I want to talk about the credits, which do a very similar thing. The first half of the credits in the remake is taken straight from the original sprite work and OST. At around halfway through, it transitions back to 3D and to the modern rendition. Again, it's just a huge homage to the legacy and staff of the original. That's really how I can best describe this game as a whole. Music, gameplay, graphics, even down to English localizations respect the original and everyone who is involved in its legacy, both the creators and the players. Super Mario RPG is not some earth-shattering masterpiece of a remake, but it's faithful yet innovative in almost everything it does. It brings the already alive world of the original to the modern frontier, so that all who want can partake in the experience. Thanks for listening.